Welcome to this walk through Philippians 1, verses 15 to 17. This is one sentence in Greek, and we'll work it through verse by verse. So our first verse, verse 15, Tenes men kai dia phothonon kai erin, tenes de kai di eudokion ton Christon kai rususin. Begin with tenes, which is a nominative plural. It's our subject. If you're using the sneeze sheet approach to morphology, like I lay out in Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek, you recall that the indefinite pronoun is our pattern for third declensions, and here's tenes down here in the nominative plural section. Men is a postpositive particle. It's a word that highlights a word or a clause or something as being distinct. It's sort of a packaging thing. It packages a word or a clause in a context of one or more items. It may be used alone, or it may be paired with the following de, as we see here. Look at kai, because kai is not joining two words that are the same sort of thing grammatically. In other words, two nouns or two verbs or two anything, clauses, whatever. And when it doesn't join two things, then it's not going to be the conjunction, meaning and. It's going to have that adjunctive sense also, or the assensive use. Even, indeed, in fact. And in fact, that's what's happening here, the assensive use. Some, indeed, dia phothonon kai erin. Dia followed by the accusative has the sense of because of. And with words of emotion, Whitacre points this out in his article on dia B2a. With words of emotion, the idea of cause can point to the source in the sense of the motivating factor. So Whitacre suggests out of envy. So phothonon is a 2D word, a second declension word, meaning envy. Envy in the sense of being bummed out by some good thing or advantage that somebody has. It can include the desire to have that thing for oneself, but the main idea is being bummed out that somebody else has it. And that kind of envy contrasts greatly with the humility Paul's going to describe in the next chapter. We're going to see that characteristic all the way through this sentence. Second part of our prepositional phrase, we got out of envy and erin. Now erin, that ending on there, is a third declension ending, so we have a 3D noun at this point. So here's our core pattern from the sneeze sheet with the endings broken out. And so here in the accusative singular, the third declensions will have either an alpha or a nu. So erin is obviously using the nu. If you look at the lexical entry, you see eris idos, hey, strife or discord. So we've got a delta here. That means we're dealing with one of the square of stops. So here's the square of stops on the sneeze sheet. And tau, delta, theta, zeta are four dentals. When you add a sigma, the dental will drop out. And here's the set of paradigms for the square of stops, what I call pattern 1 of the third declensions. So here in the dentals, charis is our pattern word. And you see charin will oftentimes show up instead of charita. This particular word can take either the alpha or the nu options. But our word erin is obviously following this one. So the phothonos contrasts greatly with the humility that Paul is going to describe. And this erin, this discord, this strife, contrasts greatly with the unity in Christ that Paul's describing, especially, again, in chapter 2. Chapter 2 is like this central vision that is radiating out in all directions in this letter. And we'll see a number of examples, both positive and negative, compared to Christ's example that Paul will talk about. And we're seeing some of that right here. So on to the next bit, tenes de kai, so the same thing, but now that repetition of tenes and the inclusion of the de clarifies the structure. Often the structure is a hoi men hoi de, which we're going to get in the next part of the sentence here, meaning some and others. So here we have some, indeed, out of envy and strife, but some, or others, indeed, through Eudokion, out of Eudokion. So the content of this second prepositional phrase then gives us the contrast, this men de contrast. Eudokia means goodwill, just simply a 1D, a first declension noun. So others out of goodwill, in other words, a kind feeling of approval and support towards Paul. So the second set of preachers has this kind feeling of approval and support. So some indeed out of envy and strife, but others out of goodwill. So far we have a compound subject with a couple of prepositional phrases. These prepositional phrases could modify the tense, but more likely they're going to modify the verb once we get that, and that comes next, ton Christon kerusosin. Simple present tense, keruso, to preach, and the direct object, ton Christon, Christ. So now it comes together. We have a simple present tense form, the direct object, two sets of people preaching Christ with different reasons, motivations. Notice the use of the article with Christon. In Greek, as in English, the definite article often points to something as specific or definite, like you'd think with a definite article. There are a number of reasons why something might be definite. Here we could have the title, the Messiah, or this could be a par excellence nuance, the best Messiah among those that have that title. And there were others in the first century that were called Messiah. Or monadic, the one and only Messiah, using the article for which there is only one. Such analysis may be too precise. It's often helpful in exegesis or meditation, but sometimes the labels can get too detailed like that. In the previous verse, Paul referred to speaking the word, ton logon lalein, speaking the word, the message. And now the core of that word or message is mentioned here, and the article highlights the one whom it's all about. So this article does have a function, even if fine-tuning the labels may not be necessary. But it clearly has some kind of function. We're going to translate this, they preach Christ, because it's hard to get that article into English without overdoing it. But it's there in the Greek and has a purpose, and it just sort of focuses and highlights and holds up that direct object. Let's look at a map of the passage to see how all this fits together. There's a couple ways we could do this first. You see what I've done is have our first subject here, and then I've copied the verb and the direct object up here and put it in brackets so that I have a place to hang this prepositional phrase. And then the second part just has flow. But what we could do is put these together. We could just have the two subjects parallel to one another here, and then one verb and direct object. This, I think, is cleaner and neater. You got to move the prepositional phrases, but then the numbers help you sort that out. So either way works. That's the thing with the mapping. There's a lot of variables that are possible, and whatever works best for you that helps you see clearly what the flow of the structure is. That's the main thing. The principles of mapping, there's a certain flexibility and there's a variety sometimes of how you can do things. Now moving on to verse 16. Hoi men ex agapes edotes hoti eis apologian tu euangeliou kemai. So we've got a raised dot here. Our sentence continues with another description of these two sets of preachers, but now in the opposite order. The hoi men here, some out of love, picking up the eudokion here. So we got the negative, positive, and now we got the positive, negative. So a little chiastic structure. When the article is used with men and de like this, hoi men, hoi de, the article serves as a personal pronoun. If this were a singular, it would be the one who, or he, or she if it were a feminine article. But in the plural, this construction can mean some. So some out of love. We saw dia up here signaling the cause in the sense of a motivation or source, and that sense is more clearly signaled now by ek, source or cause, the motivation. So some out of love. And then we get this participial cluster. You see it's set off by square brackets to highlight that. And edates, we see the omicron tau is a sign of a perfect active participle. And the epsilon sigma is that third declension ending for nominative plural, like we saw in tennis up here. But when you see aid, epsilon iota delta, you're going to have to pause, because there's two verbs that share that form. And in fact, the two verbs are related to one another. And they're both common, and they both have a lot of difficult forms. Oida, meaning to know, and horao, meaning to see, are related to one another, and in some forms they both have aid. Let's pause and take a look at this, since these are important verbs. So oida, to know, is derived from eidon, which is aorist for to see. And the aorist stem of eidon is id, as it shows up in like the subjunctive and elsewhere, but it augments to aid, and so we get this confusion. Now the meanings and uses of eidon parallel those of horao, with eidon providing the aorist active forms and horao in its principal parts the other tense forms. So both BDAG and CGEL, Danker in both of his lexicons, list horao and eidon as separate verbs. Most students learn these together, the principal parts of horao. Horao, opsumai, eidon, heoraka, opthane. So all of these are from horao with op as one of your stems here, except eidon. And so Danker treats that as it is a separate verb. It just happens to overlap completely and fill in between the two forms to get the meaning of this word. So here's BDAG's opening section on the morphology of oida. If you just read through that, you can see that it's pretty complicated. As he says, it's really the perfect of the stem aid. And it actually has an earlier letter that dropped out called a digamma, which comes over in the Latin as a V here. So video, obviously in English we picked up the Latin form of this instead of the Greek form for this idea of seeing. But you walk through here and you see oid all the way through here. Down here you get the pluperfect adane. But in between here you've got all these subjunctive forms, and here's our participle form that we're dealing with, eidos. So that's oida. Now let's look at eidon. As Danker says, it's used as a second aorist of horao. And go through here and you see you get the aid all the way through, but then you got all those ids, like I said, when it's outside the indicative. So this is a difficult couple of words. A lot of it will follow if you just realize that id is our main root of eidon, but then in the indicative it's going to have that aid. And the bottom line is when you see a word that has that as its stem, you're going to have to pause and be sure you're getting the right word, whether it's from eidon and horao, or whether it's from oida. So our word here is from oida, knowing, and then we get the content of that, knowing that eis apologian tu euangeliou, for the defense of the gospel, kami. Kami, notice there's no variable vowel or linking vowel or thematic vowel. All those are words for the same thing. You got the my ending, and this is what's known as an athematic non-me verb. It's one way to describe that. In other words, athematic, it doesn't have that linking vowel, but it's not a me verb. Me verbs are characterized that way. They're often called the athematics, but there are some verbs that just join the ending straight on to the stem. Dunamai is another one you would have learned in basic Greek, and here's kami. So in the lexicon, you just see kami. It means to lie or be placed. Abbott Smith notes that it's used as the passive of tithemi. It's used in various extended senses. CGL suggests for this passage of being set or destined for something. And Abbott Smith gives the gloss as to be laid down or appointed, and then notes that it's used with ace to signal purpose. So to be placed or appointed, and with ace for the purpose of something. So some, out of love, knowing, or because they know, it could be causal, knowing that I am appointed for defense of the gospel, for the defense of the gospel. Chemai is an interesting word because Paul's aware that he is where he is under the providential care of God. God is the one who's appointed him, who's set him there, who's put him in that place. And what he's saying here is that some folks, these other preachers, recognize that. So Paul is aware that he's under God's providential care, who loves him, and those fellow preachers who love him also recognize this same fact. And now we get the contrast. Others, hoi de ex eritheas ton Christon katangelusin, uk hagnos. I'll just take it that far for now. So again, we have a double subject. We get the hoi men, the hoi de, and one verb here, katangelusin, to preach or proclaim. And eritheia is an interesting word. I've included the material from CGEL for this one. Interest in gaining advantage over someone, another. Selfish ambition or selfishness. So these others, out of selfishness or selfish ambition, are preaching Christ. Notice the present tense in these verbs here. The verbs are describing what's going on repeatedly or on an ongoing basis. It's just part of the context Paul finds himself. While he's in prison, this activity is going on, this kerususin and katangelusin. Now they're proclaiming Christ, uk hagnos. So we got an adverb further modifying this form of proclamation. Here's what CGEL, the concise Danker, says about hagnos: with purity of professed interest, with unmixed or pure motives, sincerely. But here we got it negated, so it's not sincerely. It's got a hidden agenda is the idea. So some folks are proclaiming Christ with this bad motivation, without the sincerity and above-boardness. And this is pretty interesting statement, and Paul's actually going to, in our next sentence, going to rejoice that these people are preaching Christ, even though they're doing it in with such poor attitudes and with these sinful dispositions. So notice that the message may be true, even though the messenger has attitudes that are ungodly. It's worth pausing and thinking about it, because the purification of motivations and attitudes is probably an ongoing process in all of us. And so that point's encouraging, although it's not a reason for complacency, obviously. Since none of us has been perfected, and Paul's going to make that point about himself in chapter 3, then there's a sense in which we're always preaching and teaching beyond where we ourselves are. And since it's Christ that we're preaching and not ourselves, then we're always preaching to ourselves as well as others. At the same time, we all know that if we're not pursuing the upward call of God in Christ, then our lives can undermine our preaching. And all that obviously applies to any Christian witness, not just preachers and teachers. It's interesting here how these folks are actually proclaiming Christ, even though they have this envy and strife and discord and selfish ambition. And of course, we've probably all seen examples of that in our own day. Well, the final bit of our sentence is another participial cluster, and you see it's set off by square brackets. Oiamenoi, the men there, sign of a middle passive participle, and it's followed by an adjectival ending like this nominative plural. Oiamai, meaning to think or suppose. So you see we have a middle preference verb, and so our form is probably functioning as a middle. It's a circumstantial participle modifying the verb katangelusin. Again, it could be causal, supposing or because they suppose. Now, what do they suppose? Well, thlipsin egerein tois desmoismu. This present infinitive, egerein, from egero, gives us the content of what they're supposing. Egero, as you probably recall, means to raise. So they're raising thlipsin. Here's our lexical form, thlipsis aos he. So that tells us that we're dealing with the third declension, because we have this sigma here for the third declension, and then this aos, the genitive. So this is what I refer to as pattern 5b. The pattern 5 third declensions are those that have the stem shifts. So this shifts from an iota to an epsilon. And so this n here is thlipsin. So it goes thlipsis, thlipsaos, thlipse, thlipsin. And it means distress or suffering. It's a word for tribulation in the New Testament, an important word actually, but it can also mean trouble and distress in an interior sense. In other words, inner disturbance. So it can either be an outer disturbance or an inner disturbance, and here we're probably dealing with the inner disturbance idea. So these preachers are thinking, they're supposing that they're able to raise disturbance. In other words, they're able to cause Paul distress while he's in prison. And the final part, tois desmoismu, is interesting because here's that word for fetter or bond or chain, like we've seen earlier in the chapter. And what kind of dative is this? Well, the dative could be taken in a number of ways. It could be locative. They're causing distress to Paul in his imprisonment, or means, causing distress to Paul by his imprisonment. In other words, using his imprisonment as a means to speak ill of him. Or causal, using his imprisonment as a reason to speak ill of him. Or more generally as a dative of reference, causing distress with reference to his imprisonment, in a more general kind of connection. And all those pretty much come to the same thing. Again, the analysis may be over precise at that point. So that's a walk through some of the basic structures of the sentence in the Greek. What are we to make of this? What can we say about this situation Paul's describing here? Who are these people and what's going on? Well, since Paul will go on in the next sentence to rejoice at the preaching of these folks, then they're not going to be some of the other people that he refers to in this letter, the non-Christian Jews or the non-Christian Gentile opponents, or the Jewish Christians with doubtful views that he's going to refer to in chapter 3, verse 2. Hellerman, in page 48 in the B&H volume that he has a survey of a number of proposed views, but at the end of the day, we can only speculate. We don't have a whole lot to go on. So were these Christian preachers envious of Paul's successes? I suppose that's possible. Maybe they were put off by Paul's claims to apostolic authority, and they saw the imprisonment as taking Paul down a notch or putting him in his place. Or do we have a situation here like Paul describes in 1 Corinthians where people are picking their favorite preachers or comparing Paul to Apollos and Cephas? But in this case, it's the preachers themselves that are doing so at Paul's expense. So we just don't know. What is clear is that Paul considers these Christian preachers to actually be preaching Christ, but to be envious and divisive. So what we have is Paul in prison, and he's at this stage of his life, whether you're dating this in the 50s or the 60s, body full of welts and wounds from the persecutions that he's experienced. He's sitting here in prison. He's facing opposition from Gentiles, Jews, and false teachers, and now also fellow preachers of the gospel. And as I reflected on this, the thought that came to me is, and you think you have problems. Just an amazing picture here. And Paul's a sensitive person. A lot of people don't seem to realize that. But if you read his letters, you see how sensitive he is. And we've already seen that in this letter as expressions of love for these believers and joy in their love for him. So this opposition must have hurt. But for Paul to live as Christ. We've seen that he sets this whole section in the context of the advance of the gospel. It looks like the imprisonment would undermine the spread of the gospel, but in fact, God's using it to advance the gospel, and that's what Paul cares about. It's the promotion of Christ that he cares most about. And we'll see a very powerful expression of that in our next sentence.